I am going to be talking about not just the exploration into Dinas Emrys, but also the symbolism behind the dragon, the origins behind the dragon, and how it all ties together with this legend. So this is a beautiful aerial shot we have of the actual fort, as it's called. And I actually also have a laser pointer. Ready? That is the remains of an 11th century castle, which I'll be talking about, but we'll also be diving into the actual Beddgelert legend from the 5th century. So let's start with that beautiful illuminated manuscript from the 15th century. And this is the story of the red dragon and the white dragon. Now, according to legend, Cleith, who ruled Britain in 100 BCE, heard horrible screams every May Eve. The scream plagued the Britons, it caused infertility and chaos throughout the land, and he sought counsel from his brother, who at that time was the king of Gaul. He asked his brother what could possibly be the source of the screaming, and the brother said it was battling dragons. He said the scream was from the dragon of the Britons, the red dragon, who was fighting a foreign invading dragon, the white dragon. So Cleith decided to put an end to the battle and captured both dragons in a cauldron of mead and buried it in Dinas Emrys. Now, 500 years later, Beddgelert, king of the Britons, who was a real-life figure, fled into Wales to escape the new Anglo-Saxon invaders that had just arrived. He chose a high hill fort as the site for his new court and orders his men to build up towers on the hill. But every morning, the men awoke to find that the towers had fallen. So he went to his soldiers and said, "What do you think is happening?" And they said, "I think we need to sprinkle the blood of a fatherless child on this site." He sent his soldiers out to find a fatherless child. They found Emrys, who, depending on what book you're reading, could also be Merlin. Now, Emrys told them that there was actually a reason that your towers keep falling, and it's not just instability of the land. He says there is no curse, there is no issue here, except for the two dragons that are conveniently under this mountain. He said the dragons were causing a great rumbling in a pool, and they need to be uncovered. So as they watched from a platform, the soldiers uncovered this pool, and there rose these two dragons, the red one being a native of Britain, and the white one being a foreign invading dragon. Now, Emrys proclaimed that while it does look as if the white dragon is winning, the red dragon will always win in the end. And that is the fantastical legend that we have. But my question is there any truth to this? So, we'll see if there's any dragons that we uncover. So here we have a picture from Dinas Emrys. These are actually members of the National Trust who now owns the mountainside, and they're actually doing conservation work. They go out every single year and do conservation work, so big ups to the National Trust, not just because I work for them. And that is another view, so you can see how it's almost a natural fortress. We also have an aerial view. So this map is actually from an archaeological dig in the 50s. Fairly accurate, actually, to Google Earth. And what you see, these are parch marks. So that happens when you have a particularly dry summer, usually, in the UK. And this happens, so this is probably part of the wall. So the rocks underneath the soil are not allowing the grass to grow, and so they just end up dying during a nice summer in the UK, and we get these beautiful parch marks. So you can kind of see the outline of this fortress. And we go on into the 1st century, which is actually when we have the history of Dinas Emrys. It's the first evidence of habitation. We have post holes showing wooden structures, we have evidence of horses, and of course, hill forts were everywhere in Iron Age Britain, and Dinas Emrys was probably the #1 hill fort in terms of natural landscape. So it would have been ideal because of the valley, because of natural defenses, and because of a naturally occurring pool that happened to be there. There's also a close proximity to the river, which helped. That is a photo from the archaeological dig in the 50s where you can see the post holes from the Iron Age. We also have turrets. So A fun story about this is these are a dime a dozen. You can kick a rock and find one of these in the UK. They're everywhere. I don't know why they're designed so poorly and kept breaking, but if any of you are taking a trip to Wales anytime soon, try just kicking the ground. You'll probably find one. Then we move into the sweet spot. The 5th and 6th century, where we have inner and middle ramparts built, we have huts, we have outbuildings, we have pens for sheep and cattle, we have slag, which is kind of the runoff of ironworking, and most importantly, we have sherds, and that's not a problem. Sherds are actually the archaeological term, not shards. So sherds of pottery, dishware, lamps, all of these were actually imported from the eastern Mediterranean and from southern France, which at that time would have been extraordinarily expensive. We have a photo also from that dig. That is just an early Christian coin that was found on top of a hill fort, probably from the 5th century. And I don't have any photos of that actual expensive glassware, but we do have these lovely drawings by the archaeologist. So we have the glass, we have the slag, crucibles, stone discs. We have so many different things that were up on this hill fort. And continuing on, we have that naturally occurring pool that is artificially reinforced. We have a platform that also dates from this period. And it is revealed that structural issues plagued this site repeatedly in the 5th century, causing the towers to fall again and again. That is actually a photo that was taken a few years ago, so you can see. There's the pool. This is actually a sheep pen. There it is in the springtime, so you can see it's actually still around. And then as we move in to the 11th century, we have Llewellyn the Great constructing a castle. He was really into castles. If you go to Wales, you'll probably find that most of the castles there were originally built by him. And you can see the remains of the wall, so this is one section overlooking the lake and valley. We have another section there that was before conservation. And this is actually a rendering of what the hill fort would have looked like in its heyday. Now today, it is under the care of the National Trust, as I said. You are allowed to climb it. It actually is a fairly easy climb if anyone wants to try it. But you probably should keep an eye out for dragons. This is the literary history. This is from 1300, and it's from a French illuminated manuscript showing the story. So it's reached France by the 13th century, fairly famous. And again, White Dragon is winning. But we have to wonder, what is the truth behind this story? We have these fantastical dragons, but at the same time, we have evidence that perhaps the story was at least in part true. So we take things like the Norse sagas, we look at those, and we don't immediately dismiss them just because they may also have dragons, because they have mythological figures. We do have the basic history in those sagas, which we take as fact. So we have to wonder, what is the fact in this myth? So we look to the literary records. So the first one we had is by Gillis, and he was a historian. This is on the ruin and conquest of Britain. And it was a history of the British people before and during the Saxon invasion. And he actually talks about Vortigern as a real person. He said he was a leader with a council, but he doesn't mention what he does. Next, we have the ecclesiastical history of the English people by the Venerable Bede in the 8th century. And he also mentions Vortigern. This time he names him definitively as King of the Britons. And then if we move on to the good old Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, once again, Vortigern is mentioned, this time as the leader of the Britons, and even describes a battle in 455 that he fought against the Saxons. And if you're a fan of concrete evidence, we do have a pillar that was built in the 8th century, which does name Vortigern as King of the Britons. And I did like to mention that the mound was actually built in the Bronze Age artificially. They just reused it for their nice little pillar, which you can see nowadays. We have another lovely dragon from an illuminated manuscript. This one is from the 14th century, possibly 13th century, And it's a medieval bestiary, which was basically a guidebook of animals in the Middle Ages, back in the day when they thought dragons were definitely still roaming the earth. So we look to the Iron Age to see where would people possibly come up with the idea of dragons. This is actually what Iron Age Britain would have looked like. Specifically, this is supposed to be what London may have looked like, because we're going to be learning a bit about the first ever reference to dragons in the UK. And that is from several swords that were found in Hammersmith and Battersea along the Thames. They're at the British Museum nowadays if you actually want to go look at them. But they date from around the 8th to 6th century BCE. And some believe the creator was possibly influenced by the newly arrived Celtic people in Britain at that time. They think they may have brought the imagery with them. Being this, they are a bit hard to make out, but you can see there are two dragons on either side here, and there's a dragon here. And it's possible that, yes, they could have totally made up dragons, or they could have been influenced by the Celtic people. But bearing in mind, we have the Jurassic Coast right near Wales. And let me introduce you to the plesiosaur, which was found 3 months ago on the Jurassic Coast, sticking out of the ground. Didn't have to dig for it, someone literally tripped over it and found it. So, is it possible that they could have made it up? Yes, but to me, with how close the Jurassic Coast is, and would have been understandably terrified of it and told people of this, it's possible that this could be the origins of the Welsh dragon. But we also have to take a look at the relationship with dragons. Why specifically is Wales so invested in the dragon when no other countries appear to be that jazzed about them? England in particular, not that jazzed about dragons. But we do have this lovely little decoration. This is the Maze How dragon. I'm actually wearing the necklace of it. It's a Norse-era dragon. It was carved into a Neolithic chamber cairn in Orkney in Scotland, if you ever want to go visit it. So we have to look at, specifically, who hated dragons before we look at why Wales loved the dragons. Anglo-Saxons didn't particularly like them. They saw them as foul-natured, they saw them as evil. They used the words Draco, Draca, and worm, worm being a dragon as well. They also used snake interchangeably and had all of these evil references to them in all different ways. This is a lovely quote from 680 from an abbot named Aldhelm, who really did not like snakes, aka dragons, and he is actually talking about a wooden totem that would have been around in Wales and England at that time. Now these totems or pillars were simply just wooden poles that may have had imagery of dragons, may have had imagery of stags. It could have just been that it was a tribute to ancestors. It didn't necessarily have to have a religious background to it, but Aldhelm didn't like it. So he said these crude pillars of the same foul snake and the stag were worshipped with coarse stupidity in profane shrines. So obviously we have that reference, being we don't really like dragons that much. But we have the other problem of, if there's this intolerance of dragons already in 680, obviously the Anglo-Saxons are having issues with Wales. If Wales is already so invested in dragons, and the Anglo-Saxons, not so much, we're going to have a lot of conflict in the cultures of Wales and England. We also have the issue of Wales practicing Christianity at the same time as their local folklore, which we know exists to this day. This is actually a replica of one of those profane shrines. And we look to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for another reference to dragons. So this is actually concerning 793 in Northumbria. There is a great Viking raid that happened in Lindisfarne, which is in the northeastern coast of England. It's a tiny island, you can go and visit it. There was only generally peaceful trades with the Vikings before this time. There were a few raids, but for the most part, people weren't really worried about Vikings. However, in this time, the Vikings invaded Lindisfarne, which at that time was only an abbey full of monks. And as the Anglo-Saxon recounts, in this year, fierce foreboding omens came over the land of the Northumbrians, and the wretched people shook There were excessive whirlwinds, lightning, and fiery dragons that were seen flying in the sky. These signs were followed by great famine, and a little after those, that same year, on the 6th Ides of January, the ravaging of the wretched heathen men destroyed God's church at Luncheon. Symbol of Wales. We have this conflict already with the Anglo-Saxons, but why Wales specifically? Why were they so invested in this dragon? Well, we have the king of Gwynedd, who is referred to in a text as Insularis Draco. And that's already in the early 6th century. We have that reference of dragons to Welsh rulers. And Insularis Draco literally translates to dragon of the island, and that was probably in the context of, this is a native king. We are honoring him. And unfortunately, later it does get expanded into other adjectives. There was one unfortunate ruler who was called the inexperienced dragon, but he was still a dragon, so that's okay. Later, the Welsh dragon becomes Dreg, replacing the Latin, and it's used to describe pretty much every great Welsh ruler that came after him. We have the golden dragon of Snowdonia of Eagles, which is a very lovely way to describe someone. But we have to wonder, again, they're describing them as dragons. Is there a reason behind this? Well, the Welsh have always prided themselves on being fierce and true to their roots. Even when the Romans invaded Wales, it was only a military occupation, so in terms of cultural conflict, there really wasn't any. So at that point, the softer approach, yeah, it worked out. There wasn't much cultural conflict. That's really one of the only remaining archaeological evidence we have of the Romans in Wales. We do have their trade routes, but in terms of expanding and trying to integrate with Wales, it didn't really happen. And of course, they were met with great resistance all the time. But then the Romans leave Wales, and we think everything is going fine. Unfortunately, later, we have the Anglo-Saxons, and these are dates of every single time they tried to invade Wales. Going. Keeps going. So they attempted to invade Wales many, many, many times. There was frequent conflicts, and unfortunately it really didn't have the impact that they had hoped for. They thought, oh, they're going to be terrified of us, the White Dragon. Yeah, if you know Wales, you know that only pissed them off. So Wales started to get kind of hatred of foreigners, which is understandable. And it seemed that the more that dragons were feared by Britain, the more that Wales was invested in them. The more they pushed back and thought, yes, this is our pride, yes, this is what we love, we are the dragon. So we have, even from the earliest literary sources, the dragons are regarded as just being different in color but origins. In every single story, the red dragon is native, the white dragon is a foreign invader. And speaking of foreign invaders, let's pop over to the Vikings. We have Scotland here. This is a map of some of the great armies that marched on Scotland. We have a map of Viking burials that we know of. We have the great heathen army in England marching all around. We have all those burials in England. Yeah, not that many in Wales. Yeah, they went around them for trade routes. So we also have them fighting off this Viking invasion. They've resisted the Romans, they've resisted the Anglo-Saxons, they've resisted the Vikings. Now we gotta move on to England. They were conquered by Edward I, but the language and culture continued to flourish during that early time. So unfortunately what happened is there was an absence of native princes after England invaded. However, the local Welsh nobility continued their tradition of patronage. They encouraged poetry, they encouraged songs, and that was all done still in the Welsh language. And despite being part of the English kingdom, English kings always considered Wales to be vastly different. And that was especially apparent in 1402 with the passing of the penal laws against the Welsh. Penal laws banned them from holding office, from public assemblies, buying property in England, or even using the Welsh language in any official capacity. But even more oppressive than that, the bards and the poets were also suppressed. They used to go from town to town spreading news, spreading word of what was happening, spreading stories and tales. That was also banned because they feared that it would stir up Welsh rebellion, like it wasn't already happening. But the laws were definitive. They were formal and they were a legal separation between England and between Wales. They basically reduced the Welsh to being second-class citizens in their own country. However, in 1588, William Morgan, a Welsh bishop, translated the Bible into Welsh. This was the first time this had ever occurred in its entirety. So yes, while the officials were not allowed to use the language of Wales, the common people were still allowed to use it in their private chapels. And to this day, obviously, Welsh is still the traditional language of Wales. It's the only remaining native language of the UK, and estimates of native speakers range from 1 in 6 to 1 in 3, with a government initiative to greatly increase the number of speakers in the coming years. In summary, the red dragon has always been a symbol of strength, but more importantly, it's been a symbol of resistance. The original prophecy proved true. Despite overwhelming odds, the Welsh people resisted not only physical invasion, but a cultural one. Throughout the centuries, we've preserved our language, we've preserved our heritage, our customs, even when the white dragon continued to attack and have the upper hand. But, as the story goes, the red dragon always wins out in the end.